Hello and welcome to India's Eye. This is a discussion program on how India views the world. Today we will discuss how India and China are re-examining their ties following a meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Wuhan on April 27th and 28th. The meeting took place against the backdrop of the relationship becoming increasingly fractious. There was a military standoff on the China-Bhutan border in Doklam, which had sent the relationship tumbling. Even before Doklam, China had blocked India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group and had repeatedly vetoed the UN Security Council designating the chief of Jaish-e-Mohammed, Masood Azhar, as an international terrorist. India, on the other hand, had refused to relent on supporting either the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor or the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. After Doklam, there were signals from China last December that perhaps the relationship needed to be viewed afresh. In February, the Indian government reached out to China by distancing itself from the 60th anniversary celebrations of the Dalai Lama's exile. Subsequently, the groundwork for the summit was laid by a series of high-level visits from India, including that of the Foreign Secretary, the National Security Advisor, the Defense Minister, and the External Affairs Minister. The Chinese Vice Foreign Minister also visited India to finalize the details of the summit. A lot of formal preparations, therefore, went into what was dubbed finally as an informal summit. To discuss the significance of the summit and its impact on India-China ties, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. My guests today are Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. He is the former Foreign Secretary of India and has been India's ambassador to Russia, France, Egypt, and Turkey. Dr. Jabin Jacob, he is a senior China expert and a former senior fellow of Institute of Chinese Studies. We have with us Ambassador T.C.A. Rangachari, another distinguished diplomat. He was India's ambassador to France, Germany, and Algeria. He has also served in Beijing. I welcome you, gentlemen, to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. What were the factors which impelled Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping to opt for an informal summit in Wuhan on April 27-28th? After all, they were both going to meet in any case 4 weeks later on 9th of June in Qingdao for the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So why the rush?
I suppose the reason was, and it has been said by the government, that at this SCO summit, because it's a multilateral gathering with so many important leaders, including President Putin, there won't be enough time to have a proper summit with Xi Jinping of the kind that Prime Minister Modi wanted. In other words, a heart-to-heart chat to look at the relationship in the long-term strategic perspective and then spread over a couple of days. The other issue is that, you know, when you have things like that, unless you are having a bilateral visit independently of the multilateral summit, which then would justify your being given proper protocol treatment and talks and everything else, singling out a particular leader for exceptional attention and ignoring others becomes a diplomatic issue. And therefore, away from the clutter of SCO, they decided to hold this. But there's one important point in this, which is, I think, the most relevant, which is that there are a lot of differences between India and China on many subjects which the SCO is discussing. SCO supports the Belt and Road Initiative. On the terrorism issue, it's very difficult to get a consensus in the SCO because Pakistan is there. So I think the idea was that on issues on which there's a clear difference between India and China, there should be an attempt to have a meeting of minds and not surprise each other when the formal discussions took place, like in the case of Sushma Swaraj, who refused to accept the communique of the SCO foreign ministers on CPEC, that this sort of a thing should be avoided. So I think it did serve a useful purpose to have this meeting now.
Okay. Jabin, there's been some talk that India and China will now reset their relationship after the Wuhan summit. Now, are reset and improved strategic communication only high-sounding rhetoric, or do they mean anything? Or is it an admission that the relationship had gone for a toss? So let's sit together and see where we are headed.
I think it's a bit of all of those. I mean, reset is a very high-sounding word, calculated to give the impression that something major is happening. But I would imagine that despite this informal summit, nothing really changes on the ground in a practical manner. Or if there is any change, that change is likely to be temporary. And the reason for that is structurally these are two large countries rubbing up against each other with their own ambitions, and to a large extent they see their ambitions as running contra the other. So, it is inevitable that there will be problems in the relationship, and well, whether you call it an informal summit or any other way, it is important that the two set of leaders meet. The problem really is when you call it an informal summit, how are we to assess the outcome? If there is two sides will not even come out with a joint statement. Mind you, any previous reset, whether it was the Rajiv Gandhi Deng Xiaoping meeting or the Nixon Mao meeting, there were always communiques, statements that help people assess the significance of these meetings.
Good point.
In this case, there is no such meeting.
Okay, Ambassador Rangachari, what do informal summits achieve that formal ones don't? I mean, surely the two leaders, when they meet informally, they don't discuss their stamp collection or their hobbies. So, are you saying that just not having protocol based meetings, laying wreaths and so on and so forth and state dinners makes the summit much more significant?
I think the fact that you have an informal summit, what it really implies is that you are able to talk freely to each other without any fixed agenda. But then bilateral issues apart, because bilateral issues will always be on the table whenever two leaders, particularly leaders like the President and the Prime Minister will meet. Let us also look at the bigger context. This is a time of unpredictability and disruptions in international relations. Secondly, insofar as China is concerned, there are also certain pressures exerted by the decisions that President Trump has taken on trade, for example, certain other issues on which he wants China to work with the United States, which China may or may not be in a position to do, Korea for example. So, historically if you look at the developments of India-China relations, whenever there have been stresses in US-China relations, China has always looked to see if they not also have improved relations with India. You can go back to the Mao Smile of 1970, you can go to 1999, there are other instances I could cite. So, these are all factors, and when the two leaders meet, they will not be only talking about the problems that exist, but also the way in which they could work together for their own domestic as well as international development.
Okay. Ms. Sibal, Ranga has told us why China would want to engage India at a time like this and redraw the roadmap for the relationship. Do you agree with those who claim that as far as Prime Minister Modi was concerned, it's the run up to the 2019 election that's important for him, and he doesn't want any unpleasant surprises from China. So, he was basically buying peace till 2019. Do you agree with that?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to make a comment on what was said earlier about the absence of a formal communique. Now, in all these interactions that we've had with Chinese leadership for the last so many years, there have always been formal communiques, but that hasn't helped to resolve the differences between the two countries. So, it's not as if moment you have a formal communique, which naturally will be worded in such a manner that you will try to bring the positions of the two countries as proximate to each other. But in reality, the problems have endured.
But
the lack of a formal communique is very advantageous in this regard, that if the effort is to try and reach an understanding, and you know that you're not going to be able to reach an understanding on many of the long-standing contentious issues, then you are not actually making public your differences. You are trying to bring your positions closer, see if you can develop an understanding, but once you go into the formal exercise, then either the absence of some references or formulations which actually show that their differences are not helpful for the exercise and will actually detract from the whole exercise.
So, you're saying that international relations necessarily need to be opaque rather than transparent and accountable?
No, it all depends on the situation and the context and the circumstances. Yeah. And if in this particular context, I don't know who took the initiative, but if it was a joint initiative, the idea was to see if at the highest leadership, in view of the circumstances that are developing and the needs of the two countries, whether there can be a meeting of minds to try and lower the temperature and stabilize the relationship as much as possible and avoid a repeat of the Doklam type incident. Now, with regard to your question, my own feeling is that the biggest takeaway of this meeting has precisely been this, that both sides should have been, should have been keen to avoid a repetition of the Doklam type incident. There has been a feeling in India, whether it was right or wrong, that China suffered a setback at Doklam, and they will now look for an opportunity to create an incident somewhere along the border, and this will happen at a time when we will be in an election mode. India would be compelled to defend itself and stand up, and we might therefore risk a conflict, and therefore it's not in the interest of India to actually have a situation where China forces us into a conflict, and therefore the fact that he's gone there and they've agreed that there will be strategic guidance to the two armies, and they will then be required to build trust and manage the border effectively, I think is very important. And I don't see anything wrong if our attempt is to have a smooth and peaceful election without being distracted by a foreign adventure.
Okay. Jabin, do you think China agreed to the informal summit because it wants to prevent India from drifting far too much to the US camp, and that it's apprehensive about the Quad, that is India, Japan, US and Australia, as a strategic grouping which might challenge its influence in the region?
I'd say that is possibly one of the factors, though I don't see how realists on either side can have a reasonable expectation that this will actually be an important consideration. I mean, for the same reason, for example, if, as Ambassador Sibal just mentioned, if the Indians are going to think that because we are going to have elections, therefore we need to keep the border quiet or the relationship with China going smoothly, that's all the more reason why the Chinese will want to put pressure on us for that particular reason. You know, the international situation is always in flux. There is never a good time or a bad time for a summit or a informal or formal. The problem in this particular situation is that this is becoming too personalized. I think we have all been taken up by the fact that Xi Jinping is all powerful in China, and therefore he runs China, or he runs China government policy. That may be true in China, but if we are going to adopt the same method, and you know, while there is a formal communique, might not necessarily mean anything.
Yeah.
In our system, we need to be able to assess. It's not a one-man show. So in that particular case, you know, these informal summits do not particularly help our system. We are going along with what the Chinese want or the Chinese way of working, and that's not the Indian way.
Okay, let me take that forward with Ranga. Ranga, what he seems to be suggesting is that there are structural problems which are constants constant in India-China relationship, and they prevent an easy reset. So you can have this hoopla about a boat ride and walking hand in hand, but those real issues don't change very much. Only the optics and the atmospheric changes.
That is natural, isn't it? I mean, you know, both India and China have their own fundamental interests. These national interests at some point may coincide, at some point they may diverge. Now, the interests that we describe for ourselves are well known. It's not something which has happened overnight, and not because of Wuhan at any rate. Now, insofar as the question that Jacob Jevin just raised about, you know, the point is that as far as India-China relations are concerned, I think insofar as India's foreign policy is concerned, no relationship is better documented than India-China relations. So even if it is a one-to-one meeting between the President and the Prime Minister, there will be a record. It will not be a one-man show in the sense that nobody else except the leader knows what has been said and what he has said. This will be part of record which will be available to future generations. And this kind of diplomacy is again not something new. We have seen this also. I remember when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh went to Peking the last time that he visited there as Prime Minister, Wen Jiabao took him around, and there was a great deal of personal investment that he made in terms of looking after the Indian Prime Minister. The same thing has been done by Xi Jinping, going 2 days out of Peking, spending all that time with the Indian Prime Minister. So I think we should give credit to the Chinese that they are invested in the relationship with India. Yes, there are differences, there are problems, there are divergences, these will have to be addressed, resolved, but in the meantime, let's try and see where we can work together.
Okay, so let's talk about the divergences. So let's take the border dispute. Nothing seems to have moved. You tell me, have we moved 1 inch forward with NSA, Ajit Doval meeting, State Councillor Jechi in the last 4 years? Have we moved even 1 inch forward? So then what is the point of improving optics?
No, look, it's not as if the problem has endured because NSA, present NSA has not been able to move forward.
No, I'm not blaming.
I'm just saying there have been 20 rounds.
NSA.
There have been 20 rounds of these conversations, and at some point in time, a few years ago, the discussions had reached a dead end. And then the Chinese suggested that rather than focus on the border dispute, let this forum be used to actually address the entire spectrum of the relationship between India and China in the strategic sense. So we all know that this mechanism hasn't produced any result, and now at Wuhan they agreed that they will begin the process again. But we will come face to face with the same problems. The attempt by China has been and continues that let's not look at all these border issues and other NSG and Masood Azhar. These are old issues. Let's address new issues which are rising on the international stage, which actually have the potential to hurt the interests of both countries, which is what was just said about the trade wars and Trump's set of sanctions, climate change, energy, WTO, and the reform of the international financial institutions. So they want to shift the debate onto the issues on which the two can work together and keep their options open with regard to bilateral issues. This is the strategy which doesn't suit us, of course.
So let's talk about another constant issue, that is the trade deficit, the economic relationship. Now there are Chinese scholars who say that don't focus on the trade deficit. In fact, focus on China as a facilitator for India's industrial growth. Let us invest in your country and work towards financial surpluses. Do you agree with this?
No, I don't. I think the Chinese are being a bit disingenuous when they talk about, take that line. I mean, I agree that the trade deficit issue is somewhat overhyped. Essentially, one doesn't look at trade deficit purely only in terms of one country. You look at the country's overall trade situation. But the Chinese, I think you have to call the Chinese out on this particular score. You know, Xi Jinping goes to Davos, puts himself out as the champion of globalization. But you know, this is a bit of a stretch, because if you look at how the Chinese are blocking Indian pharma products or Indian IT services, that's because they are being protectionist at home. So by no stretch of the imagination can the Chinese be allowed to carry on with that line. Now, as far as allowing Chinese ingress into Indian technology markets, Indian financial services markets, you know, what's the quid pro quo? They come in with huge amounts of money, which all our investors want. But what's the standards? What are the what are the vetting procedures that we employ for these matters? This is something that we need to pay really closer attention to.
Ranga, another constant is India's opposition to CPEC and to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, these initiatives will continue despite India's opposition. China is not going to give up on them. So what are the choices before India? The Chinese are suggesting that, look, you don't want to join CPEC and BRI, fine. Go for projects which are complementary to it, like the trilateral China, Nepal, India corridor, revive BCIM, the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar project. Should we do that, or should India opt for corridors, economic corridors that counter Chinese corridors?
Very quickly, before I get to that question, you know, on the question of border, really I am not very clear what it is we mean when we say we want a settlement of the border. Are we looking for the satisfaction of our entire claim, which means also getting excise in? And if you are not looking for that, if you are looking at for as is where is basis, our parliament resolutions don't allow that. Is any government going to be able to have an agreement on that basis with that parliament resolution in place? Secondly, insofar as trade deficit is concerned, we are running $100 billion surplus with the United States. Now, we are running huge surpluses with our neighboring countries. So, we are in a situation where we are both on the deficit side as well as on the surplus side.
So, that is what Jervin said.
In some ways, we have to think of innovative ways. We say to our neighbors, investment as against deficit. But when it comes to China, we say, no, no, this is not acceptable, because if our systems are not at place, it's our problem, it's not the Chinese problem. Now, the question as far as One Belt, One Road is concerned, there is no specific project which has been posed by the Chinese to us on which we could work together. Insofar as, for example, Nepal, etc. is concerned, my own view is that anything which furthers Indian interests, the Chinese have money, we don't have money, but we have other capabilities, we have acceptability which the Chinese don't have in our neighborhood. If those are areas that we can leverage with the Chinese in order to work together for the betterment of our poorer neighbors, then there is no reason why we should object to that. Call it by any name, that is not important. As far as One Belt, One Road and the China-Pakistan economic corridor is concerned, they are very fundamental objections that India has, and till such time as those are resolved, not just addressed, but they are resolved, I don't see how we can support that.
Okay. Mr. Sibul, we will leave CPEC and One Belt, One Road. Now, why does one get the impression that India is suddenly appeasing China? I mean, we have thrown the Dalai Lama under the bus. We told Chinese and gave them satisfaction by saying we are not going to intervene in the Maldives because you have got interest there. Do you think this is in the hope of reciprocity, and are we going to get any satisfaction on that count?
I don't know whether these assumptions would be necessarily right. I can't see how India has not intervened in the Maldives simply because we are concerned about China's interests there. I think there are more fundamental reasons why we didn't intervene and didn't want to
And the Dalai Lama?
intervene. Insofar as the Dalai Lama is concerned, I think there is recognition in Delhi that that was an error, that the thing was not handled properly.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, but believe me, this is how it is,
Yeah.
that it was not anticipated that this circular would get leaked out. Though, of course, to my knowledge, if you have a circular on a sensitive subject like this, it's bound to
But
leak
it
out.
got leaked out one day before the Foreign Secretary's own visit to
Well,
Beijing.
you know, these are conspiracy
So
theories.
one wonders who leaked it.
These are conspiracy theories. But my well-considered view based on conversations I've had is that this was not the intention, and therefore there was an attempt to rectify it, which has been lost sight of.
Well, reports have come that
No,
India
by-
also informed China that we are doing this.
No, I don't think so. But I don't think so. But we sent our culture minister and Himachal Pradesh minister as well as Ram Madhav to Dharamsala to attend the function, which
To receive honorary degrees or give him an honorary degree. Academic function, not a political function.
the whole issue was political, that whether you want to be seen in the company of the Dalai Lama and participate in the celebrations. So I think the mistake was retrieved, though not fully, and I would agree with you that it was an error and would have been seen as a kind of an appeasement of China on absolutely the wrong issue. As it is, we have been very mature and very, how should I say, cautious in dealing with Dalai Lama politically, and there was no reason to give the impression as if we buy the Chinese arguments that we are mollycoddling the Dalai Lama for political reasons.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I've still got 3 questions, so very short answers, David. So India and China have also said that they would do a joint project in Afghanistan. What is the significance of doing a joint project with Chinese in Afghanistan? Do you think this will fob off Taliban attacks, or do you think this will condition the Pakistanis to behave in a better fashion? Why?
I'm skeptical on both those counts. In fact, I would say it's a bit of a risky venture where we trade our goodwill to help the Chinese in Afghanistan. See, if the Chinese are associated with the Pakistanis, they have a problem too vis-a-vis the Afghans. So I don't see why we should be lending them a helping hand in Afghanistan.
Okay. Ranga, now maintaining peace and deepening economic ties, having FDI, etc., investment, has its own advantages. But is there something that India can learn from the Japanese, because they've gone down this path earlier, deepening economic ties, CBMs, good relations, and look where it has left them in terms of their strategic interests.
But don't go to the Japanese and others. I'll give you a quote from the Chinese themselves. The Chinese have made it very clear that just because we have very strong economic cooperation, this was in the context of ASEAN, South China Seas and so on, doesn't mean that China will give up its core interests. So I don't think you have to look around for the experience of other countries. The Chinese have made that very clear. The point is, what is the alternative before us? We can either sort of shut ourselves off and say that no, we don't have anything at all to do with China, which doesn't make any sense. And if you're going to have any relationship, you have to see which are the areas where you can make progress.
Okay.
And as I mentioned earlier, in regard to the border and other issues and so on, there are limitations.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question to you, since you've been a foreign secretary, very successful foreign secretary, do you think that each time we appoint a foreign secretary who served in China, he thinks that he can reset the relationship with China? Is there a human factor involved? A sort of, a foreign secretary who spent time in China, goes partly native, becomes more focused on China and thinks he knows China and China is important, and therefore, you miss the wood for the trees and you just focus on China.
I think it's unfair, because this is questioning the professional integrity of whoever becomes foreign secretary. The fact that you served in a country doesn't mean that you lose sight of the overall national interest. In any case, even if a foreign secretary, based on his interaction with the Chinese and getting messages from them that they are ready for a review of the relationship, which may have happened in this case, has to make plausible arguments to the leadership, because there is a huge political risk involved. And foreign secretary's own future is online, and his credibility is online if he gives wrong advice and persuades the political leadership to take a wrong initiative. So he has to be very cautious and very sure about what he is recommending. And therefore, I don't think it is a matter of that, but I think in this particular case, it would appear that President Xi Jinping or people around him seems to have conveyed messages that they were not happy with what happened at Doklam and thereafter, and were looking and were ready for a review of the relationship at the highest level to see if these things can be avoided. It was a limited exercise. Okay. Lastly, on Afghanistan, you see, sends a very discomforting messages to Pakistan because Pakistan doesn't want a role for India and Afghanistan. Here is China saying that we can work with you, just as the Americans said we can work with you. But it helps the Chinese too, because we are also in a sense endorsing that China's presence in Afghanistan is legitimate. And finally, the Afghan government itself, in fact, supports the Belt and Road Initiative, wants stronger relationship with China. So there is nothing in this which will create any misunderstanding with the Afghan government.
Okay. So we have come to the end of this program, this discussion. I'd like to thank my guests, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, Dr. Jebin Jacob, Ambassador T.C.A. Rangachari for participating in this discussion. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again soon. Till then, goodbye.